A haughty alien empress fell in love with a shy human guard. What happened next shocked everyone. The blaster was already pressed against the back of his neck when Ethan Cole heard her voice for the first time. He had been standing guard outside the Empress's private corridor on the third subfloor of the Varen diplomatic station, a post nobody wanted, given the Empress's reputation for dismissing guards who so much as breathed too loudly. Ethan had been on duty for 4 hours without moving, without blinking more than necessary, without making a single sound that could attract attention. He was good at disappearing into the background. He had always been good at that. But someone had noticed him anyway. The intruder came from the ceiling vent, a lean figure in a matte black infiltration suit, with a pulse weapon already drawn by the time both feet touched the floor. Ethan caught the movement in the reflection of the polished wall panel, which was the only reason the weapon ended up pressed against the back of his neck instead of his temple. He had turned just fast enough to not be taken completely off guard, but not fast enough to draw his own sidearm. Human, the intruder said quietly, with a Voreth accent, a faction the Varen Empire had been negotiating a fragile peace treaty with for the past 7 months. Step aside. My business is not with you. Ethan's hand was on his sidearm. He had not drawn it. He was doing the math in his head, the angle, the distance, the fact that his armor would absorb about 60% of a standard pulse blast, and the rest of the calculation he really did not like. I can't do that, he said. You are one human, alone, with a weapon pointed at your spine. Yes, Ethan agreed. There was a short pause. The intruder seemed to be waiting for him to reach a more sensible conclusion. He did not reach one. What happened next took about 4 seconds. Ethan dropped his shoulder, turned into the weapon rather than away from it, took the partial blast against his left arm instead of his spine, and used the half-second of surprise he bought himself to put the intruder face down on the floor with one hand pinned behind their back. The smell of scorched armor filled the corridor. His left arm felt like it had been set on fire, but it was moving, which meant the bone was probably intact. He pressed his knee into the intruder's back and reached for his comm. That was when the corridor door opened behind him. Empress Zara Vashen stood in the doorway wearing a silver sleeping robe, her pale violet skin illuminated by the blue emergency lighting that had triggered the moment the pulse blast was fired. She was taller than most of her attendants, nearly 2 meters, with the sharp facial structure and luminous gold eyes that were characteristic of the Varen ruling class. She looked at the intruder pinned to the floor. She looked at Ethan's scorched arm. She looked at him. You are bleeding, she said. It was not a question. It was not concern, exactly. It was the voice of someone who had just witnessed something unexpected and had not yet decided what to do with the information. Yes, Empress, Ethan said. He kept his knee where it was. She studied him for a moment longer than was comfortable. You did not retreat, she said. No, Empress. You were alone, outpositioned, with a discharge weapon at your neck. Yes, Empress. Another pause. The intruder under his knee made a small, pained sound. I see, the Empress said, in a tone that suggested she had indeed seen something that had no clear place in the filing system she used to organize her understanding of the universe. She stepped back into her chamber without another word, and the door closed. Backup arrived 6 minutes later. Ethan gave his report, had his arm treated in the medical bay, and was told by his commanding officer that the Empress had requested he be reassigned to her permanent personal detail. He was told this as though it was a reward. Standing in the medical bay with burn gel applied to his forearm, Ethan thought it sounded more like the beginning of a problem. He was right and he was wrong, and he had no way of knowing yet which parts were which. His name went into the official record the next morning as the first human ever assigned to the Varen Empress's inner guard. Nobody above him seemed to find that remarkable. Nobody below him seemed to find it anything other than a very strange thing that would probably not end well. Ethan folded his new assignment papers, put them in his jacket pocket, and went back to standing very still in very long corridors, which was, in his experience, the safest thing a person could do in a situation they did not yet understand. He was going to need a better strategy than that. The Varan Imperial Court was not a place that made room for people who blended into walls. Ethan had spent his first week on the Empress's personal detail learning this the hard way. It was not that anyone was rude to him, precisely. The court was too sophisticated for rudeness. What they did instead was more efficient. They simply arranged the world around him as though he were a piece of furniture that had been placed in a slightly inconvenient location. Conversation stopped when he entered rooms and resumed in a lower register that did not include him. Attendants handed documents past him to reach the Empress. Visiting dignitaries looked through him to address the rest of her guard, all of whom were Varan, all of whom were a head taller than he was, and none of whom had been assigned to this post after stopping an assassination attempt with a scorched arm, and a decision that most people would have filed under professional recklessness. He learned the Empress's schedule in his first 3 days. She rose before the court's artificial dawn cycle, spent an hour reviewing communications that she never discussed with her advisors before they arrived, and then moved through a day so precisely structured that Ethan could tell the time within a few minutes just by watching which hallway she was walking down. She did not waste motion. She did not make small talk. When she spoke to her attendants, it was in the clipped, exact language of someone who expected to be understood on the first try and was perpetually disappointed by the results. She did not speak to Ethan at all for most of that first week. He was present. He was acknowledged with the same brief visual scan she gave every other element of her environment. He stood where he was told to stand and did the thing he was being paid to do, which was watch every entrance and exit in whatever room she was currently occupying and think about what he would do if something went wrong. It was on the 8th day that things changed. There was a reception for the Vorath delegation, the same faction the assassin had belonged to, which made the diplomatic scheduling feel somewhat pointed, though Ethan supposed that was the point. Peace talks required proximity to the people you were trying to make peace with, even when those people had recently sent someone through your ceiling vents. The great hall of the station was arranged in the Varan formal style. Curved tables, height-graduated seating that positioned the Empress above everyone else in a way that was architecturally intentional, and lighting calibrated to make her silver robes shimmer in a way that Ethan suspected was also intentional. He stood to her right, 3 steps back, and watched the room. The Vorath ambassador was a heavy-set man named Kurak, old enough to have been in the last war, young enough to still be calculating whether another one might be worth attempting. Ethan had read the briefing file twice. He watched Kurak's hands when the man spoke, which was a habit he had developed in his previous posting on a contested trade station, where the population had included 3 separate groups that communicated hostility through very precise gestures. He noticed, about 40 minutes into the reception, that one of the Vorath attachés had positioned himself near a service corridor in a way that suggested he was not particularly interested in the food being served from that direction. Ethan did not move immediately. He watched for another 2 minutes. The attaché moved slightly. His hand went to his jacket. Ethan was across the room in the time it took most people to register that someone had moved. He caught the attaché by the wrist before the object in his jacket cleared the fabric, a signal disruptor, which would have blacked out the station's communications array long enough for something else to happen, though Ethan did not have time to determine what the secondary action would have been. What he did not anticipate was that the signal disruptor, when its activation sequence was partially triggered by the grip reflex of a person being restrained, emitted a short-range pulse that knocked out the lights in the eastern half of the Great Hall, including the section of elevated platform where the Empress was standing. In the darkness and the sudden noise of 200 alarmed diplomats, Ethan made a decision based on the fact that he could not see her and her personal guards were on the other side of the pulse shadow. He moved toward the last place he had seen her, reached through the dark and put his hand on her arm. She went very still. "Empress," he said quietly, "one step to your left. There's a column that will put solid material between you and the room." A brief pause. She stepped left, he moved with her. His back was to the column, and she was in front of him, and the lights came back on 11 seconds later to reveal most of the Vorath delegation looking extremely startled, the attaché being held by 2 of the Varen guards, and Ethan standing approximately 4 inches from the Empress, in a way that would have been considered deeply inappropriate under any other circumstances. He stepped back immediately. He kept his eyes on the room. The Empress said nothing. A moment later she turned and walked toward her advisors, who were converging from 3 directions looking flustered. That evening, Ethan was summoned to her private office. He had been in the outer rooms of her chambers before, standing guard while she held meetings. He had never been inside the office itself. It was smaller than he had expected, a working space, not a statement space, with actual paper documents stacked on the desk in a way that suggested someone who trusted physical records more than encrypted files. She was standing at the window when he entered, looking out at the star field. She did not turn around immediately. "You position yourself in front of me," she said. "Yes, Empress." "In the dark, without orders." "Yes." "My guard is not instructed to act as a physical barrier." She turned then, and her gold eyes were doing the thing they had done in the corridor on his first night, cataloging something, sorting it into a category that did not quite fit any existing label. "You could have been harmed." "That would have been acceptable," Ethan said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think. "Because you matter more to this peace process than I do," he said, "and I don't think the peace process matters less than my comfort." Another silence. She was very good at silences. She used them the way other people used words, filling them with a weight that asked you to keep talking if you had more to say and to stop if you did not. He stopped. He had said what was true. "You are not what I expected," she said finally. He did not ask what she had expected. He got the sense that would have been the wrong question. "No, Empress," he said. She dismissed him with a gesture and went back to her documents. He returned to the corridor and stood in the dark outside her door, listening to the station settle around him, and thought that something had shifted in the last 20 minutes in a way he was going to need some time to understand. He was a patient man. He had time. What he did not have was the ability to predict what would come next, which turned out to be both the most dangerous and the most interesting problem he had faced in a career that had included several that qualified on both counts. The Varen court had a word for what Ethan was doing, though it took him another 2 weeks to learn it. The word was Sarath. It translated, roughly, as one who stands between, and it carried a weight in Varen culture that went far beyond its literal meaning. A Sarath was not simply a bodyguard. In the old texts, and the Varen had many old texts, organized with a thoroughness that suggested a civilization deeply committed to the project of knowing its own history, a Sarath was a person who had chosen, without being commanded, to place their own safety behind someone else's. The choice was the important part. Any guard could be ordered to take a hit. A Sarath did it before the order was possible. He learned this from Lyra, one of the Empress's senior attendants, who had the habit of explaining things to him with the careful patience of someone who had decided that understanding him was a professional investment worth making. Lyra was compact and efficient and had very little patience for things she considered waste, which was why Ethan found her useful. She did not say things that were not true, and she did not leave out things she thought he needed to know. "The court is watching you," she told him one morning, while they were both waiting in the outer hallway for the Empress to finish a communication meeting. "They don't know what to make of a human Sarath. It doesn't fit the framework they use for how things work." "How are they handling that?" Ethan asked. Lyra looked at him. "Badly," she said. You should expect some people to try to clarify your position for you." He was not entirely sure what that meant until 3 days later, when a senior court official named Vesrin arrived at his post during a quiet evening rotation, and told him, with the practiced smoothness of someone who had delivered similar messages before, that the Empress had many loyal guards of distinguished Varan lineage who were far better positioned to handle her personal security, and that Ethan's talents would surely be better deployed elsewhere on the station. Ethan listened to all of this without interrupting. When Vesrin finished, Ethan said, "Was that a request from the Empress?" A slight pause. "It is a recommendation from the court." "The Empress assigned me to this post," Ethan said. "If she wants to reassign me, I'll follow that order. If the court wants to make a recommendation, they can make it to her." Vesrin's expression did not change. "You are very direct for a human." "I'm told it's a common trait," Ethan said. Vesrin left. Lyra, who had been standing at the far end of the corridor and could not possibly have heard the conversation, somehow knew about it by the next morning, because she stopped by Ethan's station with a small container of Varan tea and told him that was probably not the last conversation of that type he would have, and that he had handled it correctly. "What would incorrectly have looked like?" Ethan asked. "Arguing," Lyra said, "defending yourself, explaining why you deserve to be here." She paused. "They would have found a way to use that. The fact that you referred the question back to the Empress puts the argument where it belongs." He thought about that. The Empress herself gave him no indication during this period that she was aware of the pressure being applied. She moved through her days with the same precise efficiency she always had. Their interactions were still brief and formal. She gave him instructions. He carried them out. She acknowledged the results with a brevity that left very little room for interpretation. But he started to notice small things. When the court schedule was arranged, his post was consistently positioned so that he had a full view of the room rather than a partial one. When security briefings were distributed, his copy arrived at the same time as the senior Varan guards rather than after. Once, during a long negotiation session that ran several hours past its intended end, a water ration appeared at his station between one shift and the next. No one acknowledged it or explained it. He did not ask. What he did instead was think about the Empress's actual security situation, because Vesrin's visit had reminded him that the second assassination attempt had come from within the diplomatic circle, which meant the threat landscape was not improving regardless of how smoothly the peace talks appeared to be going. He went through his notes from both incidents, and then he put together a 3-page security analysis, which he submitted through the official channel to the head of the guard, a Varan officer named Captain Davin, who had the manner of someone who had been told many things by many people, and had filed most of them under the heading of not immediately useful. The analysis sat in the official channel for 4 days. Then it appeared, in modified form, as a new operational security directive for the entire station. Ethan did not know how it got from the official channel to the directive. He did not ask. 3 days after the directive was issued, the Empress stopped at his post during her morning walk through the corridor and said, without preamble, "The timing assessment in your analysis was accurate. We missed the secondary approach vector in both incidents because we were focused on the primary entry points." He had about 1 second to be surprised before he managed a reply. "The service corridors were the real risk," he said. "The main entries were diversions." "Yes," she paused. She was looking at him with the assessing expression she used when she was revising a conclusion. "You think in terms of what the attacker needs rather than what the defender expects. It's harder to defend the second way. Most guards don't think about it the first way." She said this as a statement of fact rather than a criticism, and then she continued her walk. He stood in the corridor for a moment after she turned the corner, and then resumed his post, and thought that something had shifted again, in a way that was starting to feel less like isolated incidents and more like a direction. Lyra appeared at the far end of the corridor approximately 10 minutes later, looked at him, and said, "She doesn't discuss operational security with her own guard." "I noticed," Ethan said. "That's worth noticing," Lyra said, and went back the way she came. He stood in the corridor and thought about what it meant to be noticed by someone who was, by every measure available to him, one of the most powerful people in a civilization that had been old when Earth was still deciding whether to try fire. He thought about the weight of a position he had not asked for and had not entirely understood when he accepted it. He thought about the fact that he was a quiet man from a species that the Varen court considered, at best, an interesting diplomatic novelty, and that he had been standing between that person and the parts of the universe that meant her harm for long enough now that the standing had started to feel like something other than a job. He was not going to do anything with that thought. He was going to put it somewhere sensible and continue doing his work, because that was what made sense. What he did not account for was what the Empress was doing with her own version of the same thought, in the small office with the physical paper documents and the window looking out at the stars, when there was no one in the room to observe her revising a conclusion that she had not expected to find herself needing to revise. He had no way to see that. He could only stand in the corridor and listen to the station hum around him and notice, in the precise and careful way he noticed everything, that the world had rearranged itself slightly from the shape it had been in before. The night the third attempt came, Ethan had already been awake for 6 hours past the end of his scheduled shift. It was not unusual. He had developed a habit over the past 2 months of extending his watch during periods when the diplomatic schedule produced the kind of pressure that historically preceded instability. The treaty signing was 3 days away. The Vorath delegation had been restructured twice in the preceding week, with 2 of the original members replaced by figures Ethan did not recognize from any briefing document. Captain Davin had cleared the replacements. Ethan had put a note in his personal log that he did not like the shape of the situation, and then he had stayed at his post. At the 3rd hour past midnight, a maintenance crew arrived at the end of the corridor. They had the right credentials. They had the right equipment. They had authorization codes that matched the station's current rotation. Ethan watched them from his position outside the Empress's chamber door and thought about the fact that no maintenance work had been scheduled for this corridor in the duty log he had memorized that morning. He clicked his comm once, a signal he had worked out with Lyra 3 weeks ago that meant come to the east corridor, no noise. Then he stood very still and watched the maintenance crew begin working on a panel that did not, to his knowledge, contain anything that would require 4 people to service at this time of night. Lyra arrived in 2 minutes. She did not look at the crew, she looked at him. He tilted his head slightly toward the service access panel on his side of the corridor, the one behind him, near the Empress's door, the one that connected to the ventilation system. Lyra's expression shifted by exactly the amount required to indicate that she understood. She moved quietly toward the Empress's door and slipped inside. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not elegant, because real things rarely were. The maintenance crew abandoned the pretense when they realized the pattern was broken. One of them turned toward Ethan with a weapon drawn while the others moved for the service panel. Ethan took the first one down before the weapon fully cleared its holster, used that person as a shield for the second shot that came from the back of the group, and put himself in front of the service panel while the station alarm finally decided to activate. He took 2 hits. His armor absorbed most of the first one. The second one caught him in the side where the armor plating had a seam, which was a design flaw he had noted in his first week and submitted a report about that had apparently not yet been actioned. He stayed on his feet. That was the important part. Captain Davin arrived with 6 guards 4 minutes later and found Ethan sitting against the wall outside the Empress's door with his hand pressed to his side, and 3 members of the maintenance crew in various states of incapacitation on the corridor floor. The 4th had escaped into the ventilation system, which was going to be a problem for someone to deal with. The door behind Ethan opened. He did not look up immediately, because looking up would have required moving, and he was currently occupied with the task of staying very still. "Ethan," the Empress said. It was the first time she had used his name. He was aware of this in the way you are aware of something that changes a category cleanly, without drama, but irreversibly. He looked up. She was standing in the doorway in the silver robe again, and her gold eyes were not doing the assessing thing this time. They were doing something different, something he did not have a file for yet. "I'm fine," he said, which was a slight overstatement of the facts. She said something in rapid Varan to Lyra that he did not catch. Then she looked at him again. "You knew," she said. "I suspected," he said. "The maintenance crew wasn't in the duty log." "You stayed off schedule." "Yes." "Why did you not report the discrepancy and let the station security handle it?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I wasn't certain," he said. "And if I was wrong, reporting it would have been a waste of response resources the night before a major negotiation session. And if I was right," he paused. "If I was right, I was already where I needed to be." She looked at him for a long moment. "You could have died," she said. The words came out differently than everything else she said, without the precise, calibrated weight of a statement designed to convey a specific meaning. They came out the way words come out when the person saying them has not entirely decided to say them. "That was always a possibility of this post," he said. "It is more of a possibility because of who you are guarding." "Yes," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. The corridor was busy now, guards, medical staff, station security moving through with efficient urgency. In the middle of all of it, the space around the two of them had gone very still. "I asked for you to be assigned to my guard," she said. "I did not consider at the time what that meant for your safety." He looked at her. "With respect," he said carefully, "I was aware of what it meant. I could have requested reassignment at any point." "You did not." "No." Another silence. She reached a decision. He could see it happen. Some internal arrangement settling into a new configuration. "When you are cleared by the medical staff," she said, "I would like to speak with you, not about security." He did not ask what they would speak about instead. He thought he understood, in the way you understand things that you have been moving toward for long enough that the arrival feels less like a surprise and more like a recognition. "Yes, Empress," he said. She went back inside. He let the medical staff help him to his feet, and thought about the fact that he had been a very quiet man standing in very long corridors for most of his career, and that something was happening that was larger than corridors, and that he was not sure yet how to be the right size for it. He was going to have to figure that out. The medical staff told him the wound was serious but clean. He would need 3 days of treatment. The signing ceremony was in 3 days. He told them to do their best work quickly, and they gave him a look that suggested they were not accustomed to being given deadlines for biological repair, and then they did their best work quickly. He was going to be there for the signing. That was not negotiable. What came after the signing was something else entirely, something that had no entry in the duty log and no precedent in the station's operational history. Something that two people were moving toward from different directions and different distances, one of them very sure of almost everything, and one of them very sure of almost nothing except the thing that mattered most. 3 days, he could manage 3 days. The signing ceremony was held in the grand atrium of the diplomatic station, under a ceiling constructed to look like open sky, a Varan architectural tradition that dated back to an era when treaties were signed outdoors, under whatever sky the negotiating parties shared, because it was harder to betray an agreement made under open air. The stars visible through the transparent panels were not the stars of any homeworld. They belonged to no one. They were just stars, which was, Ethan had once read, the point. He stood to the Empress's right, 3 steps back, with a bandage under his uniform that still pulled when he moved too quickly. He moved as little as possible during the ceremony. He watched every entrance and exit. He watched the Vorath delegation with the particular attention he reserved for groups that had recently sent people through ceiling vents and service panels, and he was satisfied, by the time the final document was signed, that this particular occasion was going to conclude without incident. The room filled with the sound of applause, a Varan custom borrowed from human diplomatic protocol, adopted sometime in the previous century, which Ethan had always found quietly pleasing. Afterward, when the room had mostly cleared and the formal obligations of the day were settled, a guard approached him and said the Empress was waiting in her private office and asked that he come alone. He came alone. She was standing at the window again. This was becoming a location with associations. She turned when he entered, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then she said, "Sit down." He sat. This was also a departure from normal practice. The Empress did not invite her guards to sit in her presence. He made a note of it, and then tried to be a person sitting in a chair rather than a guard cataloging anomalies. She sat across from him, not at her desk but in the chair beside it, which reduced the distance between them considerably. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly, regardless of what you think the correct diplomatic answer is." "I'll do that," he said. "Why do you stay?" She paused. "Not why did you accept the post. Why do you continue to stay? Why, when every court official of senior rank has at some point suggested to you, with varying degrees of subtlety, that you are not suited to this position, have you not requested reassignment?" He thought about it. He had already thought about it. He had been thinking about it for 2 months. "Because I think I'm good at this," he said, and because he stopped. "Because," she said and waited. He decided to be as honest as the question deserved. "Because it matters that you're safe," he said. "Not because of the treaty, not because of the diplomatic situation, because I think you're—" He stopped again, trying to find the exact right word and not settle for one that was almost right. "I think you're trying to build something real," he said, "with the peace talks, with the court, and I think that matters, and I think you're worth protecting because of that." She was very quiet. "That is not a professional answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is also not the answer I was expecting." "What were you expecting?" She looked at him in a way that was not the cataloging expression. It was something more direct than that, more present. "I was expecting duty," she said. "Honor, obligation, the things guards say." She paused. "I was not expecting you to say you believe in what I am doing." "It's true," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why it is unexpected." She rose and moved to the window, and he waited because she was thinking, and she thought the way she did everything, precisely, without wasted motion, moving toward a conclusion that she had earned rather than assumed. "I am going to tell you something that I have not said to anyone in this court," she said, with her back to him, and the stars behind the transparent panels in front of her. "I am the Empress of a civilization that does not know yet whether it would rather make peace or make war. Every person in this court is watching me for a sign of which way I am leaning. Every decision I make is catalogued and analyzed and used by one faction or another to support a position I may not have intended to take." She paused. "I have been doing this since I was 19 years old. I have been alone in it since I was 19 years old." He did not say anything. She had not finished. "You are the first person I have been around in longer than I will easily admit who did not want something from me." She turned. "You never argued for your position. You never leveraged the incidents to request advancement. You stayed at your post and did your work, and when I thanked you, you said it was part of the job, and when I did not thank you, you did not seem to notice the difference." She looked at him steadily. "Do you understand what that is worth to someone who has lived the way I have lived?" He understood. He understood exactly, because he was a quiet man who had spent a career in the background of other people's important moments, and he knew what it felt like to be present without agenda. "Yes," he said. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him, and she was looking at him in a way that was entirely unguarded. which, given the discipline of the face he had been watching for 2 months, was more significant than almost anything else that had happened. "I don't know what to do with you," she said. "I am the Empress of the Varen Empire. You are a human guard from a species that my civilization formally acknowledged 40 years ago. There are 300 years of protocol that do not have a section for this." "No," he agreed. "The court will object." "They already do." Something changed in her expression. Not quite a smile, it was too new a shape for that, something her face was trying for the first time. "You are not concerned by that." "I'm concerned by it," he said. "I just don't think it changes what's true." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something he had not seen her do, not once in 2 months. She reached out and put her hand on his. It was a light touch, careful, deliberate, the touch of someone who knew the weight of a gesture. "I am also concerned," she said, "and I also think it does not change what is true." He looked at her hand on his. He looked at her face. He thought about corridors and ceilings and a world that had kept rearranging itself around him until it looked like this. A small office, 2 people, a question that neither of them had asked out loud because they had both been answering it for weeks without words. "What happens now?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "I have never not known before. It is a very uncomfortable feeling." "I know the feeling," he said. "Yes," she said, "I believe you do." Outside the window, the stars that belonged to no one and everyone were doing what they had always done, burning quietly in the dark, indifferent to protocol, indifferent to the 300 years of things that had never been written, illuminating the same patch of universe they had always illuminated, which now contained, in one small diplomatic station, an empress and a guard sitting across from each other with no plan and no precedent and something between them that was real in the way that only things without a name yet are real. The court did object. They objected loudly and at length, in formal sessions and private conversations, and through official channels that generated a great deal of documentation. There were 4 separate proposals to revise the Empress's guard assignment. There were 2 petitions from senior officials. There was a period of approximately 6 weeks during which the diplomatic station contained more lawyers than it had ever previously accommodated. The Empress listened to all of it. She made decisions based on what was true and what was right, and what would build the thing she was trying to build, which was the way she had always made decisions. She was not swayed by what was comfortable. She had never been swayed by what was comfortable. Ethan stayed at his post. He did his work. He stood in the corridors and watched the doors and thought about the fact that the universe was larger than protocol, and that sometimes the most important things were the ones that had no file yet. What shocked the court was not the attachment itself exactly. It was what came of it slowly, in the way real things develop, without ceremony. The Empress began to move differently through the court, not with less precision, with more warmth. The negotiations she led in the following year produced 3 additional agreements with factions that had been resistant for decades. Her advisors noted in private that she had always been brilliant, but was now operating with something that brilliance alone did not fully account for. Someone who was no longer alone in the thing they were doing. There was no official designation for what Ethan was. The court created one, eventually, in the way institutions create language for things they have no choice but to acknowledge. It drew partially from the old word Sarath and partially from the Varen tradition of counsel, and it had no clean translation into any human language, which was, when Ethan thought about it, appropriate. Some things were between 2 people and the universe and did not need a translation. He was still a quiet man. He still stood in corridors and watched doors and thought carefully about angles and entry points. He was still very good at disappearing into backgrounds when situations required it, and very good at appearing in exactly the right place when they required that instead. But there was a window, in a small office on a diplomatic station, where 2 people had learned slowly, in the way things that last are learned, that the most important thing you can do for someone is to stand between them and the dark without being asked, and to stay without being ordered, and to be present in a way that does not want anything except for the thing you are protecting to continue. That was, in the end, what shocked everyone, not the unlikely pair, not the protocol that had to be revised, not the court that had to rearrange itself around something it had not planned for. What shocked everyone was that it worked. That something built so quietly, in corridors and offices and small, honest conversations, turned out to be the most durable thing on the station. That a man who was good at standing still had found, by standing still long enough in the right place, something worth standing for. The stars outside the window kept burning. The universe kept rearranging itself. Somewhere in all of that, a treaty held, a civilization moved toward something better than war, and two people sat with their hands touching and no name yet for what they were building, which was fine. The best things rarely come with names already attached. They get named later, when the story is old enough to be told. This one is just beginning.